Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Getting There. I'm Caitlin Roger. I'm the Deputy Director of Greater Washington. This is the third installment in our webinar series on transportation issues in the Washington region and how congestion pricing could help us address these. I'd like to thank Bloomberg Philanthropies and the American Cities Climate Challenge for the grant support that enables us to offer this webinar series. This session is being recorded. So today, joining us for today's webinar is Professor Jonathan Hall, Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy at University of Toronto, who's written extensively about this topic. And we also have Kate Slevin, Executive Vice President of Regional Plan Association, who is very involved in the efforts to bring through the legislation in New York City for congestion pricing. I mentioned who I am, I'm Caitlin. And so just to give you a quick overview of today's webinar, we're going to start off with quickly tying together today's discussion with our first two webinars, which were kind of a bird's eye view of transportation, and then more specifically about transportation equity. We're going to get a presentation from Jonathan. Those of you might recognize Dr. Strangelove reference there. I absolutely loved it. And then hear from Kate about what got it done in New York City. And then we have plenty of time for discussions and questions. So in our first webinar, we heard about how land use and other policies, many to do with transportation, can create, in fact, perverse incentives for people to drive, and that can work against our equity and sustainability goals. Cars are expensive, cars pollute, cars create crashes and lead to lost years of life, lost economic growth, a lot of time spent in traffic. And we really want to address that if we're going to achieve those wider equity and sustainability goals. Current trends may favor more driving as we're moving hopefully into late stages of the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of open questions about where people in various industries are going to live and what the impact of technology like AVs are going to have. They could lead to more driving, and in fact, there was a recent report suggesting that they would, because they're going to make it a lot easier for people to drive kind of comfortably and do their thing, be on the phone and stuff at the same time. So how are we going to kind of address those proactively, think about the future proactively? And then in our second webinar, we talked about the equity context, is how historically we've had a lot of focus on the commute trips instead of kind of bearing in mind the kind of wider universe of travel that people undertake, how we make it easy for them to get there, whether it's a job or school or recreation or social needs. And there's a real need to kind of bring it back to how are we really ensuring mobility instead of necessarily the kind of 9 to 5 and rush hour trips, which I know many in our region are starting to think about as well. So today where we are is to think about mode shift. How are we making it easy for people to choose transit, walking, and biking? How are we focusing on the needs of lower income people, Black and brown communities, other underserved communities? And how do we really achieve those ambitious mode shift goals that we know that we have both in individual jurisdictions and for the region more widely? And we want to talk about today congestion pricing, or as we call it at GGWash, road pricing, as a way to kind of manage that demand, shift that demand in a more sustainable and equitable direction. So that's enough from me. I'm going to kick it over to the experts, starting off with Jonathan. And Jonathan, if you want to bring your slides up.
All right, everything look right? All right, so thank you for Caitlin and Greater Washington team for organizing this. I've been watched the past 2 seminars. They were great and they raised a lot of great questions and a lot of food for thought. And I'm excited to be part of continuing that conversation. I want to just start with acknowledging, just like Leah Brooks talked about in the first time, that people really love their cars and that's okay. Cars are really great. Cars are convenient, right? Like you're in your own car, you can listen to your own music, you don't have to smell like food of the other person next to you. Cars go point to point, right? You don't have to do transfers, and cars are usually pretty reliable. So cars have a lot of benefits, but cars also impose a lot of significant costs. They waste a ton of time with traffic congestion. They make air pollution worse. And not only do they make air pollution worse, but they make air pollution worse right where we all live, right in the middle of cities. They also have serious safety impacts. We take as granted, like the car crashes are just a normal part of life. but they kill around 30,000 Americans every year. And it's just like, that's like a small town disappearing off the face of the US every year. And it's just like, part of life, but it shouldn't be that way. And especially costly on the safety side is those costs often go to people who aren't driving themselves, right? Pedestrians bear a lot of the brunt of that cost. And so I want to start with just the simplest point that I know is like so obvious, which is that why do we get these problems is because there's too many cars on the road. But in particular, there's too many cars on the road at the same time, right? So like at its root, the problem isn't that people want to drive to work. It's that everybody wants to drive at 8 a.m. And so because we get, so we get all these cars on the road at the same time, it creates congestion. And I want to argue that it's too much congestion. Now, I don't normally get to sit around and be like, the price of milk's too high, or at least, sure, I can say the price of milk's too high, but people don't invite me to do webinars about why the price of milk is too high, right? Like I have to have a reason. Why is it I get to say there's too much congestion, right? Like prices of some goods are high. Maybe it's just that, the price of driving is high because lots of people want to do it. Well, that's not the case. I can actually make a good case, the price of driving, that there's too much congestion. And the reason I'm able to say that is because drivers don't bear the full cost of their trip. So when you're thinking of making a trip that you're not going to account for all the costs and benefits, that is, it looks artificially cheap to you. And so you're going to choose that, choose to drive. Now, we have a term for that. Many of you may have heard it already, where we say that driving imposes an externality on others. And just to be really clear about this idea, I want to walk through a simple example, which is imagine all of you, in non-COVID times, all of you have to choose how you're going to get to work. Are you going to drive? Are you going to take transit or do something else? For simplicity, let's just say the only two choices are driving and taking transit. So I am going to make this a little bit interactive. So I want you to put in the chat different things you consider when choosing whether you should drive or take transit. What is it? You got to make this choice in your daily life. What is it you think about? All right, travel time, totally. Reliability, weather, cost of parking, completely. Mental health, kids, right? Like if you have to drop your kids off, pick them up, like cars can be really convenient with that. Right, what else are you going to do after? So I want to point out something no one says. And I ask this question, right? Like I'm a professor, I teach classes, ask it to hundreds and hundreds of people. The answer no one ever gives is, do I slow down other people? Right. And so here's the thing, like, of course, you're thinking about it from your perspective. How long does it take me? What's the cost of parking? Am I going to have to be outside in bad weather? But if you slow down 900 other drivers for just 1 second each, that's an additional social cost of 15 minutes. So now I imagine with all the people in this webinar that there's someone who would say, oh, look, I drive because it saves me 10 minutes. If it wasn't for that 10 minutes it saved me, I wouldn't drive. And that if they were to consider the fact that their driving trip actually cost other people 15 minutes, that they would agree that actually, you know what, I should probably take transit. I want to be really clear. This is not that everyone should take transit, right? Again, cars are great. We want to use cars, but they impose costs that we need to deal with. And part of that is finding the people from switching to transit or making another choice is easy and encouraging them to do it. And the problem is they don't make the right choice because they don't even think about this last cost, that you're slowing down other drivers significantly. So how do you get people to make the right choice? One option is you just ask nicely. I'm sure most of you have kids, that works a lot of the time, but it doesn't work all the time. And so the ideal solution from an economist point of view is a toll. That is, you just tell people, hey, you make the choice that's best for you, and we're going to set up a toll so that you naturally consider the cost you impose on others. And so that toll we're going to charge is going to equal whatever that cost you impose on others. And that cost will include the travel time cost, a pollution cost, a safety cost. And we often call this congestion pricing, as Caitlin pointed out, maybe that's not the best term, maybe road pricing or something else would be a better name. And I also want to just make a point that in a perfect world, a totally unrealistic, but perfect world, that this toll would vary by like block, by time of day, responding to live traffic conditions. Now that's not going to be realistic, but I just want you to have in mind that that's like the perfect toll is perfectly equaling these extra costs that drivers are imposing on other people. And by making drivers pay this toll, then they naturally consider the social cost of their choice as well as the private costs and benefits. Now, the example we did earlier, I said I want you to think about driving or taking transit. But if we did these tolls right, they would actually change choices in a lot of ways other than just your choice of whether to drive or take transit. First one would be this choice of whether to travel. That is, some people would see the toll and they'd be like, I was going to go out to the movie theater tonight. I'm just going to stay home and watch a movie at home. It might affect your choice of where to travel, right? So the story I always tell my students on this one is, I used to live in downtown Toronto. There was a grocery store I could walk to and a cheaper grocery store I could drive to. And we drove to the cheaper one. But if you had made me pay a toll that it recognized that I slowed down other drivers when I drove to that cheaper one, I would imagine there were times I should have just walked to the nearer, more expensive store. There's mode choice, which we've already talked about. Route choice, which route you take to get to your destination. The optimal tool will affect this. This is mainly for freight. You can imagine that a semi-truck often has the choice of, do I drive through the city or do I drive around it? And driving around it can take a lot of extra time. And so they'll choose to drive through the city, and a toll would help them make the choice right. One we often ignore, but is very important, is the time you would travel. That maybe because of where you live, you have to drive. You don't have the choice to take transit, but for some people, they have flexible jobs, and they have the choice of leaving 2 hours earlier to beat traffic, and a toll would give them an incentive to do it. And the last one that Caitlin and hinted at earlier is that these tolls can also impact land use, the way we build and design our cities. So I mentioned earlier what the optimal toll would look like, but I want to talk about what it usually actually looks like in practice. And you often see tolling in two forms. The first is what we call a cordon toll. This is when you pay a toll to enter some form of the central business district. This is what New York City is talking about doing. It's what you see in London and Stockholm. Vancouver is considering doing this as well. LA is having some conversations around this. Something that you actually see a lot more common in North America is what we call link tolling. It's where you use a toll, you pay a toll on a specific road or even lanes on the roads. And what you've all seen in DC is hot lanes, right? So I-66, I-95, I-395, that you take the HOV lane and you say, look, if you really need to drive in this lane, you can pay to do it. And that's an option. And those tolls, right, they vary by time of day. And so when traffic's really bad, the toll's high. When traffic's less, you pay less. So California has a lot of this. There's about 10 different states that have hot lanes. There's actually over 3,000 miles of hot lanes in the United States now. And it's growing by about 200 miles a year, right? This is like really common. It's become very popular. If you're familiar with the Singapore system, it's much more like a link tolling system where you pay for certain roads than a cordon toll. And I also want to be honest, and I think it's part of why we're having this conversation, that you talk to people and you say, I want to add tolls to the roads, and their immediate reaction is they hate it. So like I talked to my aunt, and she was like, tell me about your dissertation when I was in grad school. I told her about it. She's like, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard of. And I'm like, wait, like my aunt's a nice person. She doesn't like normally say this to me. So why is it? So the first is a natural human reaction. That if I asked you, would you like to pay more for something? Like who in the world ever says yes? Please make me pay more. No one says it. And what's going on with this is, right, you tell people we want to charge you a toll, and their natural gut reaction is to say that's a terrible thing. And sometimes we try to say, oh, but look, you're going to save in travel times, which is true. But almost always, like the toll is going to be more than what people value that time saving as. And part of what's going on here is that it's just a natural instinct to not think of the whole equation, the whole thing that's going on. And there's this great analogy to climate policy, which is if you ask people, would you rather that the government subsidizes green technology or taxes polluting technologies? They'd say subsidize green technologies. And why is that? Because you forget that the money for the subsidy has to come from somewhere, or the money raised from the tax gets to be used somewhere else. And so the solution to this is either just trying to make sure whatever policies you're letting people choose between have the same budget impact, or you do what New York City is doing and you be incredibly clear about the use of the revenue, right? Like New York City's campaign relied heavily on, here's what we're going to do with the money we raise from that. There's also some real equity concerns that make a lot of people very concerned about congestion pricing. I want to acknowledge that they're real, but I also want to say they're not as bad as people typically think. And here's why. So take the context of a court and toll, such as New York City is talking about, such as London has. Who are the people who drive and park downtown? They actually tend to be the affluent, the pretty well off. And so you're going to get some people who live in the suburbs who drive into the center. They're going to switch to transit. That's going to improve congestion in the CBD, but it also improves congestion in the suburbs or in the outside of the CBD. And that improves traffic on all of those non-tolled roads, which helps the middle class, lower class people who live and work in the suburbs. All right. And so low income people in the center, well, they weren't driving anyways. Low income people in the suburbs actually see their traffic get better. Another big point on equity is that ties to this first one is that we often, again, think of this in isolation. But if we're not raising money by a congestion toll to pay for transportation infrastructure, then we're going to raise it using things like a gas tax or a sales tax. And these things are often much more regressive. So again, this is classic economist talk. You got to think of what's the alternative. What's your alternative choice? And the third one I wanted to hit is that when you talk to people about congestion pricing, some people will respond, I have to drive, like I don't have a choice. And they feel like they're being punished because their life situation means they have to drive. And Beth Osborne kind of talked about this idea in the second session, just about the fact that there's often single parents or others, they have to drive because they have to take the kids to school, they go to work, then they have to pick the kids up and they have to grab groceries. And like transit just doesn't work well for that kind of trip changing, but driving does. And so there, I just say like part of this is explaining to these people, yes, you have to drive. So let's kick the other drivers off the road so that you don't have to be in traffic. All right. It's about making it so that those who have to drive don't have to sit in traffic and other people switch. Again, I just want to summarize, like cars are great. Don't want anyone to come away thinking cars are terrible. They're great, but they have significant costs. And there's too much traffic congestion because drivers don't bear the full cost. But the solution to this is congestion pricing. So I look forward to answering your guys' questions later and look forward to Kate's comments.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. That was really interesting. Kate, I'm going to kick over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for the invitation to speak. It's one of my favorite topics and something I've been working on for far too long. So, Kate, if you could bring up the slideshow. Great. So you can move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about congestion pricing in New York City. I work for an organization called the Regional Plan Association. We're a nonprofit organization that does research, planning, and advocacy to improve economic opportunity, resiliency, and general quality of life in the New York City metropolitan region. But I've actually worked on congestion pricing at a number of other nonprofit organizations and within city government at the City Department of Transportation. Just to get you a little acclimated with our region, this is the New York City metro region. The little island you see in the center of the circle is Manhattan Island. But this is the entire New York City metro region and the area we cover. It's essentially the extent of the commuter rail lines that run in and out of Manhattan. And, you know, there's a lot of synergy between the three states, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, and a lot of, in terms of employment, labor, transportation, family, education, just a lot of movement all throughout this region. Next slide, please. To further orient you, here is the cordon toll zone that we've been talking about, or the congestion zone. It's generally the Manhattan CBD, or Central Business District, so Manhattan south of 61st Street. This encompasses Midtown Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. It's a very office-heavy district, along with a number of residential neighborhoods. And here you can see one of the problems we have in our region, and one of the reasons why we've been pushing for congestion pricing for so long, is that we have this crazy toll structure right now. We have the Hudson River crossings between New Jersey and New York are run by the Port Authority, and you pay a toll one way to go into the city. If you are coming from the east or the north, you can have a free crossing, or you can go across the MTA tolled facilities and pay $6.55. So to Jonathan's point, what do people do? They try and go to the free crossings. And what does this mean? It means there's a huge number of externalities in the neighborhoods around the free bridges. It increases the overall amount of driving, increases pollution, increases traffic congestion. So in addition to interest in raising revenue for public transit and reducing traffic congestion, we also have this crazy toll structure situation that we're hoping will get rationalized a little bit with congestion pricing. Next slide, please. And I should say those are easy pass rates, so they might seem high to you, but the cash rates are even higher. So it's how expensive it is, all of the externalities you cause when you drive into an area as dense as Manhattan. So my organization has been pushing for congestion pricing for decades, along with many others. This is actually on the left, a slide from the 1940s about the parking and traffic issues that were growing in Manhattan. And on the right is, in every generation or so, we actually put out a regional plan that is sort of a blueprint for growth and development. And in the 90s, when no one was really talking about congestion pricing at that time, we pushed strongly for the implementation of a cordon toll in Manhattan. Next slide, please. And as you can see, congestion pricing has a long history in New York City. The free East River bridges, so those are the bridges that are run by the New York City Department of Transportation, the ones that you can go to for free. We often refer to those as the East River, the free East River bridges. There used to be a toll on them, and it was taken away in the early part of the last century. And so in the 50s, there was a proposal to retoll the bridges. In the 70s and 80s, Mayor Lindsay and Koch flirted with the idea of putting tolls on these bridges. And though that's not necessarily, like a cordon fee, and effectively would have had the same result, because that's the only free way to drive into Manhattan. So, the last serious sort of proposal to get congestion pricing in place that was in this century was in 2007 by Mayor Bloomberg, and he proposed congestion pricing as part of a bigger sustainability plan called Plan YC. Now in New York City, if you have a new fee or a new tax, you have to get approval from the state. So it went to the state legislature and failed there. Then there were a couple other proposals for congestion pricing to be implemented, for bridge tolls to be put back in place, and these also failed. In 2017, though, Governor Cuomo indicated his support for congestion pricing, and I'll talk a little bit about how the situation and the dynamics were different there. And eventually this led to the passage by the state legislature, approval by the governor of a New York State congestion pricing program for New York City. And you can move on to the next slide, please. So what was different? Well, we've always had bad traffic in New York City, but around 2005, 2015, 2016, things started getting really bad. We had the introduction of for-hire vehicles. Our economy and population was booming. And, from much of the last decade or so, we've added 70,000 or so people every year. The census just came out and said that over the past decade, we've added 630,000 people. I mean, we are huge and growing, and our infrastructure simply cannot handle it. This has caused all other kinds of other problems, traffic congestion, severe housing affordability crisis. But what happened in 2015, 2016 is that more and more pressure was being put on the governor to address this situation. And it was not only happening on the streets, but it was happening underground on the subways. You can go to the next slide. The subway system was increasingly congested, unreliable, so crowded and so hard to get around. And it was meant people were showing up to work half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour late. And it was just really untenable. And so there started to be talk about a transit crisis. And New York City cannot function without a good transit system. It simply does not work. We're too dense. There's just too many people here. Half of our households do not even own cars. So without a reliable transit system, our city really does not have the potential to grow or really serve its residents well. So you can go to the next slide. We had a very strong push to get Governor Cuomo to address the situation. And this is some of our partners from the Riders Alliance, who's a wonderful transit advocacy group here in New York. But it wasn't just them. It was the coalition of over 120 organizations that essentially said, we need congestion pricing because we need to fix the transit system. We need to reduce traffic and we need it now. And this, you can go to the next slide. We had everyday riders. We had the heads of the biggest business groups in New York City. We had the real estate industry association, local environmental justice organizations, local community groups, everyone saying in their own way why they wanted congestion pricing, why they wanted to fix the subways and buses. So you can go to the next slide, please. I also think this time around, we were more sophisticated. We had already lost a number of battles for congestion pricing. So the materials we put out directly addressed how congestion pricing would improve local conditions on local transit infrastructure. So we would improve, if you look at the MTA's capital program, you could pull out the subway stations that would be renovated, the subway lines that would get service improvements. And so we put out fact sheets like this. Our partners put out similar sorts of materials. And this really helped communicate to the public the benefits of a congestion pricing program. Next slide. And obviously the benefits in other cities were substantial. They were widely reported in the media. And in particular, the reduction in hospitalization rates for asthma attacks for children in Stockholm really resonated with a lot of people who cared about public health. We have really bad asthma rates, particularly in low income and communities of color, parts of the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn. And so getting that kind of public health improvement was something that people were really interested in potentially seeing. Next slide, please. So in March of 2019, we were successful in getting legislation passed. The governor signed it, and here's what's in the legislation. The MTA, Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, is in charge. They are the ones who collect the MTA tolls. Much of this revenue already goes into the public transit system, into the subways, buses, and commuter rails. So they were well positioned to ensure that the investment was directed to where everyone wanted it to go. They have an MOU with the New York City Department of Transportation, who controls the streets and the traffic signals. The legislation created a 6-person traffic mobility panel, and we're a little delayed in this implementation timeline. I'll get to that in a moment. But essentially, they were supposed to make recommendations about toll rates, time of day pricing, various other things, exemptions, toll credits, all that sort of stuff. This panel has not been set up yet. But ultimately, they were just sort of an advisory group to help the MTA, who is the ultimate decision maker, come up with a program. The revenue target was clear in the legislation. The congestion pricing program had to raise enough for $15 billion in bonded revenue for the MTA, and that is a substantial portion of the MTA's current capital program. Their 5-year capital program is $51 billion, so it's a big chunk of that money. And this is about in revenues. This means $1 to $1.5 billion per year. The revenues are lockbox to the MTA capital program, 80% going to subways and buses, 20% to commuter rail. None of that money is going to even maintain the bridges. It's all dedicated for public transit. And there's a series of exemptions and credits in the legislation. I won't read all of them, but If you live in the zone, for example, and your household income is less than 60,000, you're exempted, and if you're emergency or disability, exemption as well. Next slide, please. So there's a lot that was not in the legislation, as I said. This slide here, you can go forward to the next slide. So a big question now is, if you pay that $13.75 toll to come in from New Jersey, are you going to pay the additional congestion pricing fee to enter the congestion pricing zone? Or if you pay the Queens Midtown Tunnel fee of $6.55, are you going to pay additional amount to come into the zone? Or are you going to be given a credit for those toll already paid? And I think there's an interest, at least from my organization and from many others, to price similar trips in the same way. So maybe not charge the full fee, but say the fee is going to be $12 or $13. Maybe you charge the additional fee above what folks have already paid. And that way you're not getting any sorts of situation where people are toll shopping or going out of their way to find the cheapest route. Next slide, please. So we're in this process now. We're going through a federal environmental assessment with, quote, robust public outreach. The program was delayed for over a year simply because the MTA was waiting for the federal government. This was under the Trump administration, to tell them whether they needed a full environmental impact statement or whether they could get away with this shorter environmental assessment. President Trump did not love New York and did not love many of our leaders. So it was just one of those things that sort of fell into the administrative abyss, and we didn't see any movement. President Biden has indicated that it can move forward. His administration is working with the MTA and other folks engaged. And so they came to this agreement that they would do the shorter environmental assessment, but they still needed this 16-month outreach process. And so that is underway now. That will last for the remainder of this year and probably all of next. And then we will go into this, the more New York State process and city process, where this traffic mobility review board will be set up. And then we're hoping for implementation in 2023. This will put it 2 years behind schedule as what was initially sort of planned in the legislation. But, we need it. And, whenever it comes is great. The sooner the better. But if we have to wait 2 years, we will, because looking long term, we absolutely need this program. Next slide. I think this goes a little bit into some of the equity concerns now. Yeah, so we're a very transit dependent region. I mean, you can see that most people, if they commute to work, go to work in Manhattan, or even if they're traveling to Manhattan for anything, they're likely to be on transit. The auto share is quite small here. It's the lines in red. And you see there's a lot of folks coming from Jersey and Long Island and other places throughout the region, and they're also on transit, or more likely to be on transit. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, we are a very transit dependent region. Lots of households here in New York City alone, over 50% of households don't own cars. So anything you can do to improve the public transit system is a pro-equity agenda, essentially. If you look at the household incomes across the city, of the 5 boroughs, if you do own a car, your household income on average is about twice of someone or of another household near you that doesn't own a car. So it's, again, a pro-equity argument. In particular, if you actually have a job in Manhattan and you do work in Manhattan, regardless of what mode you're taking to get to your job, you're likely to be making a lot more money than your neighbors who are working somewhere else. The jobs in Manhattan tend to be highly paid. There's a lot of finance jobs, a lot of various other jobs that are very, very well compensated. And so this chart, or this map here, shows, for example, and if you're living in Westchester County and you have a job in Manhattan, you make an average of $71,000 more than your neighbor who works somewhere else. So again, a pro-equity argument that folks who are working in Manhattan have more ability to pay more. And obviously, if you're driving into Manhattan, which is just crazy expensive to park, the tolls, I mean, and it's really only for folks who really have higher incomes. Obviously, there's exceptions, but generally, if you're driving, you tend to have more ability to pay more. And for those people who do drive, they're going to see a lot more reliability in their commute times. Right now, it's really terrible to drive into Manhattan. It's super unreliable. I don't honestly know how people do it because it's not a reliable situation. The congestion levels can be so high one day and much less the next, and it's incredibly stressful. Next slide, please. So I won't get into this too much, but you've probably seen in the media, we have some congressmen in Jersey who were upset about congestion pricing. But even if you look at the numbers from Jersey, they're very, very transit dependent. So most of their folks, if they're working in the city, they're likely to be on public transit. And there's also a discussion over whether if people are paying to cross the Hudson River, paying that toll that I showed you to cross the Hudson River, if they should even pay more. So we're having lots of these discussions. There's a lot of bickering between the states and all that. You can anticipate seeing more of that as the program comes closer to implementation. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into these next few slides, but we did do a pretty detailed report called Congestion Pricing, Getting It Right after the legislation was approved. We looked at a variety of scenarios that had different toll rates and such, and showed things like potential speed increases, potential greenhouse gas reductions, all sorts of things like that. So if you want to kind of walk out a little bit and go more into the details, this is available on our website. So you can go through the next few slides, Kate. And yeah, like these are some of the recommendations for design and implementation. You can read all of this on our website at rpa.org. And then for pricing, and again, it's available on our website. One thing we did find that I'll mention is that the scenario where there is a much higher peak period toll versus off-peak did the best in terms of reducing congestion, improving travel speeds, all that sort of stuff. So we'll see how that goes as the MTA moves forward. And I think that is it. Thanks very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Jonathan. Those were really, really interesting insights you both shared. We've already got a few questions, which is great. And I'm going to try and frame the first one. I mean, Elizabeth has raised a question about equity, and I think both of you touched on the topic and the idea of congestion pricing as an equity motivated move, as in someone's already paying for goods, public goods and services, and who is paying. And if it's wealthier people tending to drive more, it does stand to reason that folks who are using these public goods and services more and imposing these externalities should be the ones more directly responsible. But that might not always speak to people's lived experiences in terms of, that they're having to make a difficult decision. Oh, do I drive in, or do I, pay for some other household need? So I think the question she's raised specifically, sorry, I had it in front of me, was, has there been any more direct thought on how to income qualify the tolling amounts that people pay, or in some way, continue to subsidize necessary trips for low-income people the way that we do on transit systems? And I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on that. I know, Kate, you'd mentioned a couple actual salient points about who's using transit, but also kind of broader thoughts about how we can kind of, make sure we're not worsening people's lives, but actually improving equity.
Yeah, so there's a group called Community Service Society that's done CSS, they're an anti-poverty group in New York City, and they've done a lot of work in looking at the actual number of low income people who drive into Manhattan for work. And it's a very, very small number. So there are some people, however, it's a very small number. So our focus has been on getting free discounted fares for lower income New Yorkers. We have a fair fares program, so expanding that, improving reliability for people who are on transit, and also seeing if they have better options, like the commuter rail system is priced much higher than the local subway and bus service. So we've been pushing to open up the commuter rail system with lower fares for more people. So we've been looking at it that kind of way, but I will say New York City is a different situation, given a lot of the data I showed you, than a lot of other places where you have a higher percentage of people who are really struggling, but are owning cars. So I do think there needs to be, in each place, there really needs to be thought about that and how to address that. At the same time, like we pay for, we're a market-based society, whether you like it or not. Our cell phones, our the milk example that Jonathan mentioned in the beginning, like we pay for things and we shop around for the cheapest options. So it's sort of in line with that. And so that's sort of my perspective. There's a group in California called Transform that's done some really great work at looking at how you deal with the equity issues when you have higher rates of car ownership. And so if you want to look more on that, I would urge you to look at their reports, because they've really been leading the charge, I think, on that area.
So Kate gave a great detailed answer. Let me do the professor big picture answer, which is like, if you're gonna make other people's lives harder by more pollution, more congestion, then like you should pay for that, even if you're high income or low income, right? And that the concern that low income people will then have a hard time paying for trips, like I get it, totally agree. But fundamentally the problem is that low income people have low income, not the low income people, like this affordable housing. The problem isn't that poor people can't afford houses, it's that they have low income. Affordable transportation, right? Similar thing. And this is just the standard economist answer, which would be like address that by addressing poverty and with income supports. And then let the prices help people make the right choices. And this is why people think economists are crazy, because we're like, do whatever you want, just don't mess with the prices, whatever you do, right? And people then have these concerns. And so like, I think Kate pointed out a bunch of things people will do to address these, but I would say the bigger picture is to say, actually, in a perfect world, you wouldn't. You would say everyone pays the same price because everyone's imposing the same cost on other people. And then we'll try to address poverty more directly.
If I could make a finer note about equity, there is a way to, you could look at more closely, say people who are working in Manhattan who do have to drive. Maybe some of them are going in when we're not going to have the fee in effect, right? Maybe they're working the overnight. Maybe they're getting to work super early in the morning. So I think if you look at that, it could help figure out how to target a policy so you're really taking equity into account for that small number of people that are lower income that do have to drive.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I know there's a richer conversation about equity that's pretty much impossible to cover within an hour, but is probably going to be a topic of conversation for some time. Rick Rybeck has posed a question about pricing and land use. Most of the time I hear about cordon tolls, but over time, don't cordon tolls encourage people and businesses to move away from the central business district? Would a mileage and congestion-based toll system encourage people and businesses to locate closer together while also encouraging mode shift and off-peak travel? So maybe Jonathan, you could respond.
Yeah, so there's, this is where like, there's this ideal system where you pay block by block for how much congestion you're creating. And I know some people who think we might get there someday. I'm like, it's a beautiful dream, but and it is a concern that a cordon-based system encourages you to be right on the other side. Ultimately, I think most of the systems, they haven't seen that happening. And that's because they haven't gone crazy with the system, right? So like Manhattan has this really nice situation. There's a river, and like being right on the other side of that toll isn't like comparable to being on the right side. And so like, yes, with a high enough toll, you could see that. And yes, it would be great to have, a toll, like, so once we have autonomous vehicles, maybe we can do that like ideal system. And I think, summary, I think your concern is theoretically valid. I think in practice, it's not been a problem we've seen. But it would be great to move towards this ideal system when it's technologically possible.
Great, thanks. So Jonathan Parker has asked about the program in New York. And I think this is asked a little bit in a past tense or current tense, but it's a future program. It's not been implemented yet. So I'm going to just phrase it as, will tying the congestion pricing program to specific funding targets for the MTA capital program impact the ability to achieve congestion reduction goals? So this is for Kate. So setting prices to reduce congestion rather than hit a funding target. How would you weigh those two up?
Yeah, I mean, we've asked that there be some clarity on what the goal is for emissions reductions or traffic reductions or even improvements in transit, right? I think it's just easier for people to understand if they know the goal that is trying to be met beyond a revenue goal. And, if you look at the MTA capital program, the numbers are so huge. Everyone's like, it's very hard for the regular person to understand how $51 billion is going to be spent. So yeah, I think you can do both basically. And we've asked them to do both. They needed the revenue target for the legislation because there would just then be pressure to make the toll very, very small and it wouldn't do much in the end. And they needed some clarity for their capital program over how much additional revenue beyond the congestion pricing they needed, right? But yeah, it would be great to have some clear targets in terms of emissions. I would even say public health, like we should be tracking that and reporting on it publicly so people know what they're getting for paying those tolls.
Yeah, I think that's an argument we haven't really touched as much on is the public health aspect. And I know one actually, London actually touched on it briefly. They're looking to expand their program partly based on a public health basis, is that they had kids walking around with these little backpacks that detect air quality, and what it showed worried folks. And I think it does attach to our current issues. We know that the COVID pandemic has had differential effects on different groups. If you're in an underserved community, you tend to be more likely to experience respiratory issues, and that puts you at higher risk of a whole host of health issues. So it's interesting to me how that kind of the social determinants of health argument really comes in here.
Yep, absolutely.
So back also for Kate, I would be interested in Jonathan's thoughts as well. Do the variable price model perform as well in terms of the overall reduction of driving VMT mode share commute as a fixed price?
So I think in our scenarios, the variable price performed better, especially in speed increases, which was our look at severe traffic congestion. That's how we calculated it. And we didn't look, I know the MTA is looking now more specifically at a bunch of different scenarios, so we should have more information. And things have probably changed since COVID because it's more like traffic just stinks all the time now. And the peak period is bad, but it's sort of even more spread out over the day. And I don't know if folks across the country are experiencing the same thing, but here our traffic levels are well above, what they were pre-COVID, and our subway ridership is still, 50-60% of pre-COVID. So it's a real problem.
I'll also add, somewhat depends on what your goal. So totally agree, right? But often if the goal is dealing with congestion, you really want variable tolling because then you give people a reason to leave early. And that's often for most people, the easiest adaptation they can do. And so make it easy for people to adapt. And that's what variable tolling does.
Yeah, this relates a little bit to a question from Rachel. How does Manhattan congestion pricing affect people who have car-dependent jobs? And I would extend this out to say also, Jonathan, your reflections of wider, schemes in other countries. People who have car-dependent jobs, contractors, delivery drivers, are these sources of opposition? And, do they tend to have to pay?
They love it. Oh my, contractors love this. You know how much money they lose stuck in traffic? Oh no, any delivery contractor person, I mean, I can't, not 100%, right? But like for them, this is like a huge benefit. They would happily pay the toll to not be stuck in traffic.
Yeah, and they're still working out how commercial vehicles will be treated in New York City. The legislation said passenger cars would only get fee or fine what fee have to pay the toll once per day. We haven't figured out yet what's going to go on with commercial vehicles. And I will say that I didn't touch on this, but the first phase of the bigger sort of plan to fix traffic in Manhattan was the creation of a $2.75 fee on all for-hire trips south of 96th Street. So the for-hire vehicles and the taxi trips, they're already paying additional fees. So that's being collected. That money is going back into public transit. It's like, last I checked, it was like over 400 million a year. So I don't know that they'll be asked to pay additional beyond that, since they're already kind of paying their share.
So I'm going to just touch on a couple thoughts that I have and reflect in response to this discussion today. One was, Jonathan, you'd mentioned sort of the, everyone wanting to drive at 8 a.m. Of course, we're moving into a space where it's a little bit ambiguous and unclear, how transportation patterns are going to settle. Like, it seems from my perspective, we're still in this flux period where we don't know, if there's going to be smoother trips throughout the day. I mean, we've also touched on some wider issues for wider reasons why, cars on the road aren't great for lots of reasons, including, the time, the equity, the amount of money, the environment. But any thoughts that you have in your academic crystal ball, or indeed Kate, about is congestion, how much is that going to kind of be affected by the COVID pandemic?
So I think we'll get more work from home permanently, right? So yes, that will help some with congestion. But like a lot of that, if work from home becomes more that some jobs will leave the city, other jobs will come back to the city to take it. Like I don't see congestion going away because we can now work from home 1 day a week or something. I do think there'll be people with more flexibility to work from home in the morning and then come in the afternoon, so that people will have more ability to respond to tolls. But I don't think it's like, oh, we don't have to worry about this, everything will be fine. In some ways, I think the ideal time to put in place where people not as many people need to drive right now, and then you have time to readjust. You have a lot of choices to make in your life, right? That you can adjust that take time. I get you can't implement this in 3 months, but in a perfect world, this would be a great time to put it in place.
Yeah, and there's plenty of people who rode public transit the whole year, all of 2020. I mean, the bus systems in particular around here never saw quite the decline of commuter rail and subway, because they serve more people. They serve a lot of the urban areas, say in Jersey, where essential workers live, and people were riding on buses to allow our economy to keep functioning and to go to work. So, our priority is improving transit fundamentally and first for the people who are transit dependent, who are sort of the core of our economy. And, more broadly, I don't know, there was all this stuff at the beginning of the pandemic. Oh, New York City, big cities are over. And it's all just a bunch of horse shit. Sorry. New York is like totally alive. People want to be here. I think if there's more flexibility to work from home, even if people move out of the city, their jobs are still in New York, and they're still going to have to go in every now and then. And they still want to be close to the city because it's a great place and it's vibrant, and their families there, their friends are there, their communities there. So, I think you might see these small changes happening that will affect people's lives. That being said, longer term, that small shift in how people commute and where they work has pretty substantial impacts on specifically the transit system, right? Because if you aren't collecting those fares every day that you have less money to pay for operations, you have less money to pay for, the day-to-day expenses. So that's the thing we worry about, and kind of this new economy we're seeing happen. And also, we worry about a potential shift of jobs, not necessarily like white collar jobs, but like restaurant jobs and other, like we worry about where those jobs are going to shift to accommodate it. If they're going to go to outer boroughs or what have you. We've seen a little bit of that happen. But I think, longer term, it's New York. Like people are going to want to be there. The economy is strong now. It's getting better every day. We have a lot of problems that we need to overcome, but there's a history of the city kind of picking itself back up. And I think we're going to be able to do that this time around, no question.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you. The appeal of the city is not, it is age old, it is ancient, and it has to do with a lot more than sort of, precise job location, although that's a big part of it. So I was really lucky to be in London around the time that they implemented congestion pricing. And so I always refer to my father-in-law index. So the person who's now my father-in-law was my boyfriend's dad at the time, really against it. He was driving to work every day. He thought, this is a really, really terrible idea. It's gonna make my life so much worse. And I thought, oh my God, this is great. It took him 4.5 months to get there. So that's how I kind of judge that in terms of, at first it is an adjustment. Change is hard for folks. But I would just be interested, I've heard in my kind of travels about this kind of valley of death where, congestion pricing gets passed in a city. It's a little tough for people to get used to initially, but then they do kind of get there. I wondered if either of you could kind of speak to, how that's looking to you and sort of how you get past that point of adjustment.
Yeah, I mean, people hate change and it's going to be hard to make people pay more. At the same time, if you have an Easy Pass account, a lot of people don't look at that. So as long as they're not able to actually, see the infrastructure and they're paying, additionally beyond what their Easy Pass account already shows, I think some people won't even notice it. And if we do get the improvements in traffic, the reductions in traffic and the improvements in the transit system, that's much more visible to people. So I think that's what people will end up noticing more than potentially, the fee. And also more people are, as I said, way fewer people are driving than are on the streets, walking, cycling, or are on the public transit system.
Yeah, I'll just add that what you described shows up lots of places, right? Like that there's a transition period where people hate it. And in part, that's because when something's passed, those who are going to lose recognize it and they complain, but those who are going to benefit don't necessarily know, and so don't lobby on behalf of it. And then after, with time, you find that, wait, there's a big group who's really benefited from this.
Yeah, I think that kind of question about benefits, both the who and the how is a big part of it. Andrew's also dropped in the chat, questions about like, is congestion pricing the right question? Terminology, we've touched on that quickly because it is a much bigger kind of picture. I think initially, and again, drawing from the London experience, a lot of the support initially in London was from the business community because congestion was absolutely killing them and making it a lot harder both for people to get to their businesses and for them to get deliveries, for their workers to get in. And so you really get back to that time is money kind of trope around, you pay $10 or whatever the charge is, and you save yourself 20 minutes, 25 minutes, half an hour. I think particularly that's got an interesting angle to it in the late COVID time when we're all kind of valuing our time maybe in slightly different ways than we used to. So any final thoughts from our panelists before we wrap up? This has been a lovely discussion today.
No, I don't have any thoughts. If folks have additional questions or want to know more as this moves forward, feel free to reach out to us, and hopefully it will get implemented and we'll be the first in the country. Fingers crossed.
We're pulling for you, Kate. We really are. And just to mention, DC is also looking at this issue, and it's really helpful to have the example of New York.
No, I just think it's congestion pricing. I always feel like there's lots to hate about it, and there's lots to love. And it always drives me crazy that like the left and right both have things to love about it, and they both have things to hate, and they only pick on the things they hate. I'm like, come on, there's a lot of good things that can come from this. Yes, there's some challenges, and smart design can deal with this.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. Really enjoyed the questions, and we will be sending out a recording of the webinar in due course. Yeah, appreciate your time and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.